Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately. Please, this is a restricted area. Norman Randall, 83 years old, with knuckles like polished riverstones and eyes the color of a faded sky, did not move. He stood at the threshold of the cockpit, his body a frail but unyielding dam against the current of fear sweeping through the airplane. The Boeing 777 gave a sickening lurch, a giant shuddering in its metal bones, and the screams from the cabin crescendoed into a unified wail of terror. The flight attendant, a young man named Kyle with a perfectly coiffed haircut and a name tag that read lead flight attendant, put a hand on Norman's arm. It was meant to be firm, commanding, but it trembled. Sir, you do not understand the gravity of the situation. We have a medical emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated. You cannot be here. Norman's gaze remained fixed past the attendant on the chaotic array of lights and screens inside the cockpit. He could see the co-pilot slumped over the center console, the captain leaning impossibly far back in his seat, his head against the window, chest still. The plane was on autopilot for now, but it was flying dumb, a blind beast in a sky full of storms and other traffic. The gentle program chime that announced turbulence was a mocking counterpoint to the raw human fear that filled the cabin. Kyle's voice cracked with desperation as he stared at the old man before him. Is this some kind of joke? Are you lost? Do you even know where you are, old man? He saw a grandfather, someone's confused patriarch who had wandered toward chaos instead of away from it. He saw nothing but a liability, a problem to be managed in an already impossible situation. Norman finally turned his head just slightly. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a stillness that was profoundly unsettling. They were deep and clear, and in them Kyle saw not confusion, but a terrifying and absolute calm. I know exactly where I am, Norman said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that had been weathered by time and pressure. I'm at 34,000 feet in a $30 million aircraft that is about to become a coffin for 164 souls, unless someone flies it. He took a steadying breath, the air thin and cold. Now, son, I suggest you get out of my way. The altitude indicator was unwinding like a broken watch. Your altitude has dropped 400 feet in the last 90 seconds, Norman observed, his voice flat as iron. Your airspeed is fluctuating wildly. The autopilot is fighting weather it wasn't programmed to anticipate. This situation is not under control. It is a managed fall, and that management is failing. Another flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah with wide, terrified eyes, hurried up the aisle. Kyle, what's going on? Air traffic control. They sound urgent. They need an update now. Tell them we are handling it, Kyle snapped, never taking his eyes off Norman. He felt sweat trace a cold path down his temple. This old man had become a focal point of defiance, and in the compressed, high-stakes theater of a metal tube hurtling through the sky, that was a dangerous spark threatening to ignite panic. Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the groaning of the fuselage. I asked if there was a pilot on board. He came forward. Kyle scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that cut through the tension like a blade. He came forward. Look at him, he probably flew crop dusters in the 1950s. This is a flying supercomputer with systems he couldn't even begin to comprehend. What could he possibly do? We need a current, certified 777 rated pilot, not a relic from a museum. Norman didn't flinch at the insult. He seemed to absorb the verbal blow as if it were nothing more than a puff of wind. His attention was elsewhere, processing 1,000 points of data from the brief glimpse he had gotten of the instrument panel. He could hear the engines, the strain in their whine. He could feel the vibration of the fuselage, the subtle shifts in air pressure against the skin of the aircraft. The plane was talking to him in a language Kyle would never understand, and Norman was listening with every fiber of his being. License, Kyle demanded, his hand outstretched, palm up. If you claim to be a pilot, you will have a license, a current one. Show it to me right now. Slowly, with deliberate care, Norman reached into the pocket of his worn leather jacket. He pulled out a creased wallet, its edges softened by decades of use. His old fingers fumbled for a moment with the worn folds, not as nimble as they once were. Kyle watched with growing impatience, his foot tapping a frantic rhythm on the carpeted floor. Come on, Grandpa, Kyle muttered, the slur dripping with condescension. We don't have all day. The clock is ticking. Yes, it is, Norman said quietly, his voice still unnervingly calm. He finally extracted a small laminated card from the wallet. It was an FAA pilot's license. The photo 20 years old, showing a man with the same steady eyes but fewer lines etched into his face. The expiration date was valid, current. Kyle snatched it from his hand and stared at it, his mind racing through the implications. It was real. Norman Randall, private pilot, multi-engine certified. It wasn't an ATP license for a commercial airliner, but it wasn't nothing either. Still, the gulf between flying a private multi-engine plane and a Boeing 777 was the difference between a go-kart and a freight train. This doesn't qualify you, Kyle said, shoving the card back at him with barely concealed contempt. Not for this beast. You would be a greater danger than the autopilot. The autopilot is a tool, Norman said, his voice hardening for the first time since the confrontation began. It follows orders. It cannot improvise. It cannot feel the air. He nodded toward the churning gray clouds visible through the cockpit window, a maelstrom of weather that threatened to tear them apart. You need feel. You need instinct. You need a pilot. The plane bucked violently without warning, throwing Sarah against the galley wall with a sickening thud. A chorus of metallic crashes echoed from the back as service carts overturned, spilling their contents across the aisle. The overhead bins rattled ominously, and the emergency lighting flickered on, casting the cabin in a ghostly, apocalyptic glow that made everything look surreal and nightmarish. The autopilot disengagement alarm began to blare, a piercing, repetitive shriek that cut through the chaos like a knife. The managed fall was no longer being managed. "We are stalling!" Norman's voice cut through the alarm, a blade of pure command that brooked no argument. He pushed forward, no longer waiting for permission or approval. Kyle, off balance and paralyzed by the sudden escalation of the crisis, stumbled backward. Norman was in the cockpit. He moved with an economy of motion that belied his 83 years, his hand immediately going to the yoke, his eyes scanning the primary flight display with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times before. He saw the critical angle of attack warning flashing red, the airspeed bleeding away into the danger zone. With firm, steady pressure, he pushed the nose down sharply, a counterintuitive move that sent the plane into a controlled dive. Norman reached into his wallet again, his left hand never leaving the controls, never wavering in its grip. He didn't look for his license this time. His fingers found a small, hidden flap of leather sewn into the wallet's interior. As he pulled it open, a patch became visible. Its colors faded to muted earth tones by time and memory. It depicted a fox, lean and cunning, its body formed from what looked like carbon fiber, set against a backdrop of a starless black sky. The image triggered something deep in his mind, a memory as sharp and clear as the day it was forged. He was 25 years old, his face streaked with sweat and grime, sitting in the suffocating cockpit of his F-4 Phantom. The night sky over North Vietnam was alive with fire, a hellish tapestry of red and green tracers crisscrossing the darkness like deadly fireworks. An enemy MiG was on his tail, a predator hunting in the dark. He could hear his wingman's frantic calls over the radio, the panicked breathing of a man facing death. But Norman was calm, ice-cold calm. He saw the patterns, the geometry of the fight unfolding before him like a mathematical equation. He rolled, pulled, and dove, not just flying the machine, but becoming a part of it, a ghost in the night. He vanished from the MiG's radar, reappearing on its 6 o'clock position, a specter dealing death from the shadows. When he landed, his flight suit soaked through with sweat, his commander had slapped the newly designed patch onto his shoulder with a grin. "We're calling you the Carbon Fox," the man had said, his voice filled with respect and awe, "because you're made of the night itself, untouchable, invisible, lethal." The memory vanished as quickly as it had come, but its power lingered in Norman's bones. Sarah had regained her composure enough to understand that Kyle's obstruction had become the single greatest threat to their survival. He was still sputtering, still arguing, desperately trying to reassert an authority that had evaporated the moment the stall warning had sounded. She grabbed the cockpit radio handset, the one used to communicate with air traffic control. Kyle shot her a furious look, his face red with impotent rage. "What are you doing? Put that down immediately." She ignored him completely, her fingers fumbling with the controls as she switched to the emergency frequency. Her voice came out as a strained, breathless plea. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, Transatlantic 721. We have total pilot incapacitation. The aircraft is currently under the control of a passenger, a volunteer pilot." The voice of the air traffic controller came back instantly, sharp with professional calm, but underscored with palpable tension. "Transatlantic 721, we copy your mayday. We are clearing all traffic in your vicinity immediately. Can you identify the volunteer pilot? We need his name and qualifications. We need to know who is flying your plane right now." Kyle lunged for the handset, but Sarah turned her body, shielding it from his grasp. "He's an old man," she began, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "We don't know much. He has a private license." But before she could finish, Norman spoke, his eyes still locked on the horizon ahead, his voice a low command that filled the small space with undeniable authority. "Tell them," he said quietly. "Tell them Carbon Fox is on the stick." Sarah paused, confusion warring with the instinct to obey the calm certainty in his voice. The name meant nothing to her. "What, sir? They need your actual name for the record." "The name won't mean anything to them," Norman said, his voice flat and final. "The call sign will." There was an absolute certainty in his tone that was impossible to argue with. Hesitantly, Sarah keyed the microphone again. "Air traffic control, the volunteer pilot. He asked that I relay his call sign. It's Carbon Fox." There was a moment of dead air on the frequency, a silence that stretched for 5 seconds, then 10, an eternity in the world of emergency aviation. Kyle let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "Carbon Fox, you see? He's delusional. We've handed a plane full of innocent people to a madman." But then the controller's voice came back, and every trace of professional detachment was gone, replaced by something else entirely, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. "Transatlantic 721, say again that call sign. Did you say Charlie, Alpha, Romeo, Bravo, Oscar, November, Foxtrot, Oscar, X-ray?" "Affirmative," Sarah said, her own voice barely a whisper now. Carbon Fox, in the dimly lit high-security command center of NORAD, deep within Cheyenne Mountain, Air Force General Marcus Thorne nearly dropped his coffee mug. The message from Denver Air Traffic Control had been piped through to him as a matter of standard protocol, just another civilian emergency to monitor. But the call sign had hit him like a physical blow to the chest. "Get me a lock on that transponder, now," he barked, his voice echoing through the vast operations room. A dozen operators jumped into action, fingers flying across keyboards. "Is that call sign authentic?" a young lieutenant asked, his face pale. "There's only one Carbon Fox," Thorne said, his eyes glued to the screen. "I thought he was dead, or at least faded away like all the other ghosts from that war. Get me the 49th wing at Holloman. I want 2 F-35s in the air 5 minutes ago. Tell them who they are escorting. Use the call sign, they'll understand." Back on the 777, Kyle was reaching his breaking point. The strange exchange with air traffic control, the old man's unnerving calm, the sheer impossibility of the situation had all curdled into a furious, desperate need to reassert control. "That's it," he announced shrilly. "John, help me get him out of that seat. We're putting this plane back on autopilot and following standard procedure." "That would be a mistake," Norman said calmly, adjusting their heading. "The mistake was letting you in here," Kyle retorted, grabbing Norman's shoulder. "I am ordering you as the ranking crew member to relinquish control immediately. If you do not, you will be arrested for interfering with the flight crew the moment we land." "If we land," Sarah whispered, her face pressed against the cockpit window, her mouth agape. "Look." Out of the churning gray clouds, 2 shapes emerged with breathtaking speed and precision. 2 F-35 Lightning, 2 stealth fighters, the most advanced combat aircraft in the world, materialized as if summoned from thin air. One took position off the right wing, the other off the left. They were so close you could see the pilots in their futuristic helmets. Carbon Fox, this is Ghost Lead, a young professional voice crackled through the military frequency. We have you 5 by 5. We are your escort. The sky is yours, sir. Just tell us where you want to go. Kyle froze, his hand still on Norman's shoulder. He heard the call, heard the reverence in the pilot's voice. He looked from the F-35, hanging impossibly still, just a few hundred feet away, to the old man in the pilot's seat. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical shock. His face went chalk white. Ghost Lead, this is Carbon Fox, Norman keyed the mic. Good to see you, boys. Let's head for Nellis. The landing was textbook perfect. General Thorne stood at the cabin door. General Randall, he said, saluting sharply. It is an honor, sir.